All right, hey everybody. Hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy. This is the first of our Screencastify videos, and before we get into the chapter that we're working in, I wanted to talk about what's happening in the world today and kind of tie that into some of the stuff that we've already talked about in human geography. As you guys know, I've said it before, the human geography course is really split in two by semester. The first semester is about the world at large, and it's kind of how you as an individual fit into this globalized world. And then the second semester, or the second kind of part of the course, talks about the individual. And it looks at religion and culture and identity and philosophy and kind of the development of the individual. So what's happening in the world today with this coronavirus and kind of global understanding of pandemics, it fits very well with what we've already talked about this year. But I think there's pieces that we're yet to talk about, the individual part of it, that come into play too. So I'm going to try and in 5 minutes here kind of tie all this together for you, and maybe that helps you pay attention to what's going on right now because we're living through a significant part of history. We always talk about the big events, world wars, major pandemics, economic crises. Those tend to get a lot of attention in a typical history classroom or when you study and know history because they're times of crisis and stress, and how people manage those situations. Um, they 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 kind of they come to coin that event, right? So you look at something like World War II, and we immediately start talking about the leaders and the personalities of the day and how that impacted the era. We talk about Hitler and Stalin and kind of the evil axis and I know they were on opposite sides of the war, but they still represented something in relation to the war. And then you look at Churchill and FDR and some of the democratic ideals that persisted through World War II. Cold War, same idea, right? We think about the leaders and the people in charge and how they manage the situation, and you can do that on and on with everything. 9/11, um, the Great Depression. So we're living through an era that is going to be remembered as a world crisis, and the leaders today are going to be evaluated based on how they handle this crisis. It's easy to lead when things are going well. It's difficult to lead when things are in crisis mode. And I would ask that you, over the next couple of months, really pay attention to leaders and how they're handling the situation. And I use the term leader to kind of mean a broad number of things. Yeah, we always look at global leaders, and that's who I mentioned, global heads of state during these major events. And of course, we're going to do that again for this event. So certainly pay attention globally to how different countries are managing this and how their leaders are managing this. But I also want you to pay attention to the local and the state level. Pay attention to what the governor is doing in Ohio. And if you look at how this situation has been handled in Ohio, it's kind of become the poster child for how to do things correctly in a crisis situation. You have Ohio, Michigan, and Louisiana that all reported their same coronavirus, case, the first one, around the same time. If it wasn't the same day, it was very close. And Louisiana and Michigan both have 4 times as many cases as Ohio does. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way in which our leaders, state and local, responded to this. And you can see a huge difference, and it's really interesting to look at the way in which our governor has slowly put these things into place to help mitigate some of the harmful impacts of the coronavirus. Look at our local. How are local politicians handling things? How are local businesses and business leaders handling themselves? You hear stories all the time about some businesses not really caring about their workers and not doing anything for them during this crisis, forcing them to more or less come to work or not get a paycheck. And um, if they don't succumb to the pressure, right, they're kind of deemed as somebody who is not worthwhile to the company. On the other side of things, you hear companies that are giving people more money There, if you work during the coronavirus, you get a 20% pay increase. You see a number of companies that are giving additional paid time off. So if you need time off to help a family member, if you need quarantine time off because you've been exposed, you can take that time off and still get paid. And other people that are working through this crisis, get a huge shout out to the medical personnel that are going to work every day with sick individuals during this crisis. And a lot of places are giving them a 20% pay bump for doing that, just to do the right thing. So the character of individuals, the motivations, morality, and ethics of individuals are all coming to light here. And I would just pay attention to all of that, even how your local school board, your administrators, and your teachers are responding to this, trying to help people through the situation. You find in these crisis situations a lot of positive stories about the human condition and human nature come out, and so I would encourage you to pay attention to all of those things. Now, the reason why this is such a concern, and to connect it, that's kind of the globalization piece of it, but to connect it to us and take a look at the individual side of things. We talked about pandemics in the first quarter just briefly, but one of the things that we didn't connect is the pandemic to the globalization to the individual. And what I mean by that is we live in this highly globalized world. We've had pandemics in the past. This one will probably not be as bad as the others, and a lot of that has to do with the globalized world that we live in. It's both I would say, the problem and the solution. We talk about interconnectedness, and the world is very interconnected to China. They play an important role in the global economy. And the movement of people all over the world in and out of China led to the pandemic spreading as quickly as it did. And that's part of being globalized. That some might say that's the negative side, is something like this is going to spread so quickly. At the same time, we also have a global network of healthcare, and that's going to help. You have companies all over the world working on vaccinations. You have companies all over the world working on ventilators and masks, and trying to help people. And so the interconnectedness is also the solution. You also have, because right now we're just talking about transportation networks and the movement of people, but you also have communication networks and the movement of ideas. And that is part of the solution. The ability to work from home is a lifesaver for so many people. The 1918 flu epidemic had a terrible impact. It killed on the low end 20 million people, and most historians estimate it to be closer to 50 million people. And a lot of that was the lack of medicine that was available at the time, the lack of communication. You couldn't quickly get information out, and it was very difficult to know what to do and how quickly it should happen. You go back to the Black Plague in the 13 and 1400s, that kept coming back again because people didn't know how to manage the situation, and it continued to spread. In some cases, the solution they had was the wrong thing to do. It actually caused more trouble. And over time, they weren't able to prevent it from happening again. Same with the influenza. There was a series of flu outbreaks after 1918, some of them worse than the original, where in this case, we have medical personnel globally that are working on vaccines. They're working on ventilators. They're working on solutions for people. Again, globalization part of the solution as well as the problem. You as an individual, and the reason why this is such a big deal for you to quarantine and take care of yourself. And we know that one of the positives of this situation is the coronavirus does not go after people that are healthy. The flu was not like that, and that's why we had so many that died. Perfectly healthy people with no underlying conditions were dying from the flu. That doesn't seem to be happening with the coronavirus. It seems to be targeting certain segments of the population, and that means that a lot of people feel safe, which is good and bad, right? You being your age and me being my age, and generally healthy, if we are healthy individuals, we're not as scared of the coronavirus as people were of the flu. At the same time, we have a obligation to our local community and to the global community to do the right things so that it doesn't spread and it doesn't get to parts of our population that are vulnerable. So while you may not die and you may not pass it to anybody that dies, if you get it, making a good decision to prevent yourself from getting it and spreading it to others could save lives. And I think that's what's happening in Ohio. Again, going back to comparing Ohio to, say, Michigan or Louisiana, the number of deaths in Ohio is a lot lower, and the death rate in Ohio is lower. And the reason for that is there's less people going to the hospital all at the same time. And if there's less people in the hospital, then the ones that are there can get the care they need. If we overload our hospitals, then we don't have the ventilators available or we don't have the care that we need. And that means people are going to die that wouldn't have otherwise died. And so the idea here is let's slow the spread. We know it's going to spread and we know people are going to get it, but let's slow the spread. Let's give our medical personnel the time and the space that they need to handle the worst cases. And let's save as many people as we can. And that is the key. And so when you stay home, you don't necessarily do it for you. You do it for your family members, you do it for your community. And together, 8 billion people are trying to do this to help each other so that we can slow the spread and give our medical people time to come up with vaccines and other solutions. Anyway, I wanted to kind of connect all of what we talk about in human geography to the individual piece that we're talking about now. And I hope that you've taken away from this class that there's 8 billion people in the world, but we're all connected. And whether we want to be or not, globalization is here. It's our reality. It's not going to change. We're only going to get more globalized as we progress here. And recognizing that you're not just an Ohioan or you're not just a Clevelander or you're not just an American, you're part of a global community. And what you do, the decisions you make have an impact well beyond you. And the more we can do that, the more that we can live with this understanding that we're all in it together, the better off we're going to be in times of peace and tranquility and in times of crisis. And so I hope that you can kind of connect what we're talking about, recognize the importance of what our government is asking us to do, and do your best to adhere to those things for the time that they give us so that we can try and limit the spread of this and limit the number of deaths as best we can. Okay, with that, I am going to move on and we are going to jump into the PowerPoint. So here's where we ended. All classes kind of finished this activity as the last thing. And I believe I went through with both classes the pie chart here and talked about some things. But let me do it again real fast because this should be review for you. Review from 3 weeks ago, but still review. So if you look at the pie chart here, this covers everybody in the world. A lot of times when you look at a religion chart, which we will jump and do in a minute here. So here's another one that we're going to look at. This, as you can see, only lists religions. It doesn't list non-religious people. If I go back here, this includes non-religious. So this includes everybody in the world. And that's why the percentages here are going to be a little different than the next table that we look at. And a lot of times, if you look up numbers on religion, they don't include non-religious. And so the percentages are going to change because it's percentage of people that are religious versus percentage of people that live in the world. And we're looking at percentage of people that live in the world. So what's interesting, if you combine Christianity and Islam, that's 55% of the world that follows one of those two faiths. And there's a reason we say that. It's because these two are splinter religions. Islam and Christianity broke off from Judaism. And you'll see that Judaism is the smallest of the religions that are listed here. You do have in other a bunch of small religions that are smaller than Judaism. So that is true that there are religions out there that are much smaller. But the major religions, and of course, Judaism is important because it's a foundation faith. It's an original. Uh, Theoretically, I know that the Jewish calendar is close to 6,000 years old, a couple hundred years under 6,000 years old. So if you're Jewish, you believe that the world is 6,000 years old, approximately. But from a historical perspective, Judaism is born out of old animistic faith. Animistic faith goes back tens of thousands of years. And so you could make an argument from a history perspective that Judaism is tens of thousands of years old, or at least tens of thousands of years in the making, might be a better way to say it. But it is an original core faith, and it's only 22% of the world's population today. Meanwhile, Christianity splintered off from Judaism and recreated itself into a new faith. although it brought with it many of the old Jewish traditions. Same with Islam, where Islam broke off and created its own faith. And Islam actually incorporates parts of Christianity and Judaism because it came about 600 years after Christianity was born. So it's interesting to think that the two splinter religions that came from this original Jewish faith are so much larger in percentage of total population than Judaism is. And we're going to talk in the next slide about why that is. Again, non-religious is usually something that surprises people. I know in the responses to this activity, most of you wrote that you weren't surprised. And I think we are living in a more secular world. I think the United States is probably more secular now than it was 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And so this may not be as shocking to you, but I think to older generations, it would be somewhat shocking. And there is a general movement, and we talked about this already, but there is a general movement globally away from organized religion. And that's one of the things that we talked about previously, and I'll actually come back to it towards the end of the whole PowerPoint. So probably sometime in the next few weeks, we'll talk again about why there's a decline in organized religion globally. Okay, the next one is Hinduism. And again, that one is really interesting because it's only one country. I mean, for the most part, if you're Hindu, you are Indian, Indian. And so it just shows you how big that India is. At 1.3 billion people, they actually account for 14%. Their religion accounts for 14% of the world's population. So that's kind of interesting. And it's the last of the really big ones. Right now, we jump all the way down to six, and you really have three that are generally about the same in number of people that adhere to them. Primal indigenous, that was something that shocked a lot of you guys. You didn't realize that there were so many people still living that old animistic faith. But if we count here, it's one, two, three, four, and number five are tied for five, and the most number of people in the world. So there are still a lot of primal indigenous people. The truth is, guys, we really don't know how many are out there. There's a lot of these tribes where there's very limited contact outside of the world, and we don't really know for sure exactly how many people. A lot of that is guesswork, but we have a general idea, and it's probably in the six range. Chinese traditional, we talked about what if China is more people, they're about 1.4 billion. So if they have more people than India, how is Hinduism more than twice the number or percentage that China is? And the answer to that one is quite simple. China has forced atheism. Since they became communist in 1949, they have looked down on religion. Religion isn't necessarily illegal, but if you were to say or do anything in China that doesn't fit with what the government believes, and religion can oftentimes conflict government, that could lead to problems. And so the Chinese government looks down on religion, and you are allowed to be religious as long as you're pretty quiet about it. And that means that a lot of people will not say that they're religious even when they are. So we could probably assume that Chinese traditional is a little bit higher. There's more people kind of following this than will answer or will be recorded in some kind of a survey because of the way the government promotes, we'll say, atheism. Okay, Buddhism is a splinter faith. So it's kind of the opposite. Hinduism is your like core faith. Hinduism is much like Judaism. It is technically in the 6,000-year-old range, but it's developed over time, over tens of thousands of years. And you could make an argument that Hinduism is the only major religion today that has a really close semblance to primal indigenous faith. As we learn about Hinduism in the next video, actually, next slide video presentation I do will be on Hinduism. You're going to see how it's connected to kind of the animistic faith that we've been talking about. So this is your original, probably dating back tens of thousands of years, and Buddhism is the splinter. So Buddhism split off, and so did Sikhism. So the opposite is true in the East. In Eastern faith, the original has more adherents and the splinters have less. In Western faith, Judaism, the original, has less adherents and the splinters, Christianity and Islam, have more. So that's another interesting piece to all of this. Okay, most of that should have been a recap for you guys. Now we're going to move on to some new information. Okay, so on the last slide, we were talking about why some religions grow and why they become so big, kind of like a Christianity, versus why some religions don't grow and they stay the same. And when we learned about Zoroastrianism before we left, we hit on this idea. if you're a faith that says you have to be born into this religion and they don't generally accept converts, a convert is somebody who leaves one faith and joins a different faith. So if it's an ethnic faith, if it's a faith where you're born into it and you don't really accept new members, that's going to be a fairly smaller faith, percentage wise. If you're a universalizing faith, that is one where the religions actively go out and try and convert people. That is going to grow the religion very quickly. For a faith to be universalizing, it does have to offer some universal appeal. You can't have a faith that is really unique to a specific area of the world where their teachings wouldn't fit with the culture of the area. If that's the case, it's not going to work. Even if you do try and convert people, people aren't going to convert. So universalizing faiths need two things. Number one, they need to believe that you can convert, not that you have to be born into it. They have to believe in conversion, and then they have to offer some sort of system that is universal in appeal. And that will then make you a universalizing faith, and you're going to grow fairly quickly. Ethnic faiths, again, do not, because you essentially have to be born into that faith. So let me click on the video here. And instead of having you guys go to the PowerPoint line and watch it, I'm just going to click it here and let you guys watch it. It's a short clip. It kind of goes with what we're talking about here. And you're going to see that there's not a lot of talk. Actually, there's no talk, but the visual and the timeline on the bottom, I want you to pay attention to. So you want to talk about religion spreading out. Watch what happens during the age of exploration, which we're hitting now. And they're going to run through this again with you real quick. Watch it in real time. And then the last 500 years. And you can see kind of the explosion of Christianity and Judaism. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. So these are the symbols for the three. Here's another world map that shows you where each of the religions is centrally located. Okay. So what I really like about that is it shows you the timeline, which is something we're about to get into. But it shows you the timeline and it shows you the area of the world in which these faiths kind of came into being. And then it shows you the spread to get to the numbers that we're talking about. It shows you how religion spread around the world and how really Christianity and Islam came to be such large religions. So the table that you're looking at here is, of course, a little bit different. Like I said, it takes out indigenous faith. Or sorry, no, it takes out non-religious or secular people. So the numbers are now going to change in the percentage category. So in the last one, we were looking and said, well, 33% of the world is Christian. Well, 41, nearly 42% of the world that believes in religion is Christian. And that's a total of 2.1 billion people out of about 7 billion people that lived in the world at the time that this chart was made. So obviously, these numbers have gone up. Islam, 1.34 billion, or we're going to say 27%, right? So if you're paying attention now and you kind of add those numbers up real fast, I'm going to round it and say that 2/3 of the world that believe in religion believe in either Christianity or Islam, which is a really interesting stat. And there's your Hinduism, Buddhism, traditional belief, and then Sikhism and Judaism. So that kind of lays out the rest of them for you. You can see the number of people, and then you can actually see the percentage of the world. Now, you're going to notice that numbers are all over the place. For example, the video we just watched said Judaism was 18 million. This one says 13 million. It's really hard to get these numbers. I kind of said that already, but in a place like China, of course, it's hard to get real numbers because people won't always answer things correctly. Same here. So this table in particular was actually created by going to the congregations around the world and asking congregations to report back how many members they have. And they were able to compile that data and create this. So, for example, it says that there's only 13 million Jewish people in the world. What this means is there's 13 million Jewish people that are registered as part of a temple, and they're going to get counted then. There's probably a lot of Jewish people that are still religious but may not be a registered member of a particular temple, and they're not going to get counted. And so these numbers could be off. And it's a great time to remind you. I know we talked about this way back when, and some point in the first semester, we talked about reliability of data. Yeah, we definitely have to call into question a lot of this. There's some guesswork here. And we assume that there's a lot of Jewish people that aren't part of a temple, and so you want to try and account for those. And so some people might say there's 18 million, some people may say there's 13 million. Hard to know for sure, but at least we understand this. It kind of falls in this neighborhood. And this list, if you look at the distance between, is fairly solid. These numbers may not be exact, but the list and the percentage is probably pretty good. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the religions themselves without having secularism as part of that. Here's where they are located in the world, and this kind of fits with the video we just watched too. A couple things to point out. You can see that our hemisphere, North and South America, are Christian. So yes, you find pockets of down here your traditional and traditional mixed, right? So yeah, you do have kind of pockets here. And there's some that are so small that they don't show up because nearly every country in North and South America has indigenous people somewhere. So they're showing you large pockets, but there's a lot of people everywhere that are still considered indigenous. And what they try and do too, like, you look at South America, it is mostly Catholic, but there are areas where there are Protestants. And so you'll see down here, there's a little key, and it kind of shows you those different areas that are evangelical Protestant or Jewish or Sikh or Islam. So they use some identifiers there, and you can see there are parts of the world that are more diverse. Okay, so there's your Christian. You can see that most of the Protestants live in the United States and Canada. Most of the Catholics tend to live eastern seaboard and a little bit southwestern. And you've got most of Latin America, we'll say, is Roman Catholic. Jumping over to Islam, and there's different versions, of course, Sunni and Shia. But you see that Islam is really centrally located. Here's Mecca, as you saw in the video. This is where Islam originated, and it's spread out from there. it went into West Asia, and it went into North Africa and around the Horn of Africa. And same thing where we could say there are Christians in every country all over the world, so are there Muslims all over the world. We're just saying this is generally where people are. And you'll see this little spot right here. Those are a bunch of stars for the Star of David, Judaism. That's Israel. So, yes, you do have somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million Jewish people that live in Israel, and that is a Jewish state. And that is the original birthplace of Judaism, right here around Tigris Euphrates. That is now Tigris Euphrates is actually a little farther north, but Judaism originated here, but it's settled in and around Jerusalem. And Jerusalem and surrounding area known as Israel is a Jewish state today. Okay. As we move around, Hinduism is really centrally located in India, like we talked about. You have different forms of Buddhism that are spread out throughout the rest of Asia. That includes China. So you see that there's Buddhism in China, along with the Chinese traditional religions, Taoism and Confucianism. So you kind of get a mixture of some core foundation faith, like Taoism and Confucianism, and then Buddhism kind of overlaps into those areas. What's really interesting is that you find that people in these areas like China will say, well, I am Taoist and I'm Confucianist and I'm Buddhist, and they'll claim to be part of three religions. And as we talk about those religions in the coming slides here, you'll understand why. That is actually true. Somebody who's Muslim could say, well, I am Muslim, but I'm also Christian and Jewish. And somebody that's Christian could say, hey, I'm Christian and Jewish, because there's a shared tradition in those faiths. All those faiths have Abraham and Isaac. Most of your Old Testament stories are in all three books. And I say Old Testament because it's what you're probably most familiar with. But the original, of course, is the Torah. And these are stories and traditions that appear in all three religions. So technically, if you're Christian, you are also Jewish. You follow Moses and the Ten Commandments, which is one of the cores of the Jewish faith. But we don't explain it that way. We don't see it that way. Out in the East, they do. And you'll see the same as Japan. If we go to the next one, Shintoism and Buddhism. Buddhism and Shintoism work together in Japan, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. But Shinto is animistic. So theoretically, you could take Shintoism and drop it down in traditional shamanistic. But it's kind of its own thing now because Shintoism and Buddhism have more or less married, and it's kind of all the same. Yes and no. That's a difficult kind of concept to explain. But there's a lot of crossover between what is Shinto and what is Buddhist. And if you're in Japan, you believe in Shintoism, but when you say Shintoism, you actually mean a lot of things that are Buddhist in nature as well. So that kind of gives you an idea of the world today and where people are. Let's go back to the beginning again and talk about the hearth of religion real fast. Remember, a hearth is a starting point, it's a beginning, and there are 4 starting points of religion. So the idea here is that each of these religions developed without any knowledge of the other. And so modern day Greek philosophy, which is North Mediterranean, that developed first in this region and then kind of spread out from here. And if we jump down to Judaism, Judaism developed in the Eastern Mediterranean, again, Tigris Euphrates area. They developed without any knowledge of having this Greek philosophy that was there. And remember that all of these are polytheistic. Judaism, I know, is monotheistic today, but it wasn't 6,000 years ago. Jewish monotheism started about 3,500 years ago. For at least 2,000 years, it's believed that Judaism believed in polytheism, and we've already talked about that and how that happened. So all of these were animistic at one point. Judaism became monotheistic. Greek philosophy became polytheistic, and eventually a lot of what is Greek philosophy found its way into Christian and Muslim faith. So this is still around today. It's not really practiced by anybody, but its traditions are part of modern faith in a number of different ways. And we'll talk about that as we get to Christian and Islam, or Christianity and Islam as we study them independently. Hinduism today is still animistic, and we'll talk about how that is and why that is, but Hinduism hasn't changed a whole lot. You can make an argument that Hinduism is more like a tribal indigenous faith than any of the other major religions today. And then, of course, Chinese philosophy, same thing, believed in multiple gods. We actually call it a philosophy more than it is a religion. It's more of a way of life, an understanding of how to live, as opposed to a explanation of the afterlife, or an explanation of the spiritual world that we can't see but think, and if you believe in a tradition, know exists. So Chinese philosophy is a really kind of different understanding of religion, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Taoism and Confucianism. Okay, so here are our four main faiths. All religion today, major religion today, has splintered off from this. And this gives you a little bit of an idea. We go back here, and this fits pretty well with the video we just watched too. So all these slides kind of feed off of that. Here's 1,000 years BCE, before Common Era. So this is 3,000 years ago. This line represents. So as of 3,000 years ago, you had these faiths. You had the Yellow River, which is China. You got the Indus Valley, which is actually Pakistan today, but back then it was part of India. Tigris Euphrates, which is modern day around Iran, Iraq, and then Nile Valley, which of course modern day Egypt. And so all of these religions were kind of developed. The religions that came out of these regions were developed in this era. We call it the Great River Valley civilizations. They go from about 3,000 years ago to up to 10,000 years ago. And you'll find that humans, as they stopped being hunter gatherers and chasing their food and started growing their food, they settled down along rivers. And all the early civilizations were along fresh water supplies, which is fairly obvious, right? You need drinking water and you need water for the crops, fresh water for the crops. So they came up with some early irrigation systems, or they started to understand the weather patterns and planted in areas that had enough rainfall to support the crops. So you have all of these major civilizations and therefore these early religions growing up along river valleys. Yellow River, of course, that region gives birth to Taoism and Confucianism. The Indus Valley gives birth to Hinduism, and then Buddhism, and then Sikhism. This is something we'll talk about when we get to Hinduism, but there was actually what we say a Vedic Aryan cultural invasion that occurred right around, we'll say, 3,000 years ago, maybe 3,500 years ago, where people migrated from what is today Eastern Europe, and they migrated actually across the Middle East through the Himalayas and settled down into the Indus Valley, and a lot of their traditions, which would be more of these traditions, were brought in and became part of Hinduism. So, believe it or not, Hinduism has an element dating back thousands of years, has an element of European and Middle Eastern philosophy and understanding, and that's the Vedic Aryan cultural invasion into the Indus River Valley. Okay, Tigris and Euphrates combined with the Nile Valley. Obviously, these areas are pretty close, and over time, they combined and they became one civilization known as the Ancient Near East civilization. That gave birth to monotheism and polytheism. So you've got Judaic monotheism and some other versions of monotheism that were out there that didn't quite survive the test of time. And then you've got Greek philosophy, which of course was reborn in every country a little bit differently. Egypt had its own kind of mythical philosophy, and Rome had its own understanding of gods and goddesses and their philosophy. So this polytheistic Greek philosophy ended up being reborn in a number of different traditions. But essentially, if you look at all of them, it's kind of the same gods. You have different names and different stories associated with them, but it's more or less the same from a broad perspective. It's more or less the same thing. Now, out of this, you have this period that is really, really influential. It's the 500 years before the birth of Jesus and the 500 years after the birth of Jesus, approximately. In that time, you have Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Christianity, and Islam all born. So, five religions in about 1,000 years that give us our main core faith today. And Chinese philosophy, if we drew a line, we would split it here and we'd say about 500 years before the birth of Jesus. So right around in here, Chinese philosophy kind of has two directions it goes. Believe it or not, Buddhism was about the same time, about 500 years before the birth of Jesus, 2,500 years ago. You get Buddhism. Sikhism doesn't come until much later. It's like 1600s, 1700s where you get Sikhism. That's a little bit more modern. It's only a couple hundred years old or several hundred years old. And of course, they show it to you on here, but Christianity is born, and 600 years later, Islam is born out of Christianity and Judaism. And Greek philosophy has an influence on all of it. And we'll talk about that more when we get to Christianity and Islam, the influence of pagan Greek philosophy on all of that. So this kind of completes that timeline that we were looking at. What you're going to find, it goes with the video we watch, and it goes with everything that we've talked about so far. What you're going to find is religion comes together and it diffuses to different places, and it can have some conflict associated with it. In other cases, there's limited conflict, but religions come together to be reborn as a new faith. So, for example, Buddhism could have led to a lot of conflict in Japan when it migrated there, but it didn't. It actually, in a lot of ways, married the traditional Shinto faith that was there, and it recreated itself. Same thing happened. We can make the argument that the same thing happened when Christianity diversified and went out into North Africa and Europe over 400 or 500 years while it was an underground faith, because it was not accepted by the Roman Empire, and Christians were persecuted. So it grew up kind of underground. And as people were being born into a pagan faith and being raised with Christian principles, those two things meshed. And Christianity today carries with it a lot of pagan tradition. Same with Islam, and I could go on and on. So diffusion of religion oftentimes means conflict, but it also means a diffusion of ideas and a recreation of understanding of faith. So this gives you kind of a quick arrow pointing what the video showed you, but it's something that you can go back to without having to open the video to kind of remind yourself of who went where and when. Islam staying centrally located, Hinduism staying centrally located, Buddhism traveling throughout the Asian world, and of course Christianity with the age of exploration, pretty much covering the globe. North and South America for sure, coastal Africa and Southern Africa for sure, into parts of India, and actually throughout other parts, the arrows don't point, but throughout other parts of Asia and into Australia and New Zealand. Okay, your activity, and this will be the end of today's lesson. I'd like you guys to get into groups of 2 or 3. If you want to work in a group of 4, that's fine. No more than a group of 4. Create a Word document, or sorry, a slide, not a slide, a Google Doc. And when you're done, share it with me, put everybody's name on it. Or if one person wants to write while everybody else talks through a Zoom or a FaceTime, you can do that. And the person that writes it up, please put everybody's name on it and email it to me. This is due on Wednesday at 8 a.m. So April 8th, Wednesday at 8 a.m. I'd like you guys to please have this emailed to me or shared with me. Make sure everybody's name is on it, so everybody that works on it gets credit. What I want you to do is consider what happens to a society or a society's religion when a different religion diffuses to that place. So talk me through or write out some of the things that you see or you assume would happen as religion goes to new places. Also, I want you to describe how religion shapes culture. When a certain religion comes to a place and infiltrates a place, how does that change people? How does that change, when we say culture, that's all encompassing. How does it change people's daily activities? How does it affect individuals? How does it affect relationships? How does it impact government, legal systems, judicial systems, things along those lines? So talk about the impact that religion has as it fuses to a place, and how that can change culture or shape culture. Okay, thanks again, everybody, for listening. If you have any questions, you can bring those up during our Zoom session on Wednesday or shoot me an email. Hope everybody is staying safe, being a good global citizen, and we will see you guys Wednesday morning at 9:40 in Zoom.